This happened between 1986 and 1987. My father bought a farm in the middle of the Arizona desert, which the locals called Diogi, which roughly translates to a place of danger, or a hazardous area. The first week or so went without incident. I was just a kid at the time, only about 5 or 6 years old, so this story is basically secondhand knowledge since it was told to me, and now I'm telling it to you. It was around the third night or so of the second week, give or take a day or two of us living in our new place, when I found myself in a scary situation. I can't remember what I was doing at the time, but that doesn't matter. What matters is that I was in my parents' bedroom when suddenly, out of nowhere, there was a knock on the window. My parents looked at one another in confusion, and then my dad walked over to the window and pulled the curtain back to take a look. What he seen left him completely dumbfounded. Nobody was there. He looked out into the darkness, but didn't see anything out there either, so there wasn't much more he could do. Just as he was climbing into bed for the night, he heard the knock on the window again, but this time it came from the other end of the house. And again, when he looked outside, nobody was there. As he turned his back on the door, intending to go back to bed, all hell broke loose. The knocking started again, but this time it was all over the house. Every window in the place was being bombarded by something invisible, and we had no idea what it was. Not knowing what to do, my dad gathered us all together so he knew where everyone was during this unbelievable situation, and then suddenly something completely unbelievable happened. Rocks, small pea-sized rocks, started to fall from the sky. Like it was actually raining rocks down onto our house. The noise was enormous. It went on like this for hours, and all we could do was cover our ears and wait for it to end. The next morning, we discovered that half of the farm workers had left as soon as the sun had come up. They didn't want to stick around, believing that our presence on the farm had upset the Bilasana Ligai, the Navajo way of saying desert witch. They believed these desert witches were responsible for the chaos we had just lived through. Over the course of the day, a few more workers had packed up their stuff and left as well. They had no interest in any dealings with these witches, and on their way out, they told us that we should leave too if we wanted to live. Things slowly escalated from there, as if testing my parents' patience, seeing how much they could take before losing control of themselves. A number of times when I was playing alone, I would call out to my mom because I wanted some stranger to leave me alone. But when my mom finally reached me, there was nobody there. Other spirits also started appearing around the house and garden. I believed that these were former owners and inhabitants of our farm, possibly even victims of the desert witches who were now tied to the property forever. They appeared to be from an earlier time. I had seen an old man smoking his pipe as he wandered around the house. I don't know if he realized he was a ghost or not. The smell of his pipe smoke would sometimes fill the house, making it easy to know when he was nearby. Luckily, he was not evil, he just liked to wander around. A few nights later, there was some commotion in the barn. From the house we could hear horses being moved around and men talking, but we couldn't actually hear what they were saying. The sound of the horses gradually intensified, as though there was something incredibly wrong in the barn, and the men's voices turned into shouting until suddenly and out of nowhere, it would go completely silent. This usually lasted anywhere from 5 minutes up to 4 hours, and it happened almost every single night. Then there were our dogs. Our healthy German shepherds would just sit there with their eyes twitching and rolled back in their sockets, and their mouths foaming, almost like they were having a seizure without moving their bodies. At first, my parents thought the dogs had been poisoned, but as soon as the dogs were put in the truck to go to the vet, when the truck reached the edge of the property, they snapped out of it and were just fine. This too became a regular occurrence, and eventually we just ignored the dogs when they did this. Things took a turn for the worse after that. The clatter of stones pelting the corrugated roof intensified, and the mysterious presence began targeting humans. One evening, while my father and 17-year-old brother lingered on the patio, a stone shot out from the darkness and struck my brother squarely on the forehead. Both my father and brother equated the sound to a shrill whir, as though the stone had been flung from a slingshot. Determined to apprehend the culprits, my father installed bright spotlights around the property and ruthlessly removed the charming fruit trees surrounding our home that my mother liked. And yet, despite his efforts, the disturbances persisted without a soul in sight. It was as if the projectiles materialized out of thin air, leaving us stunned and a little anxious. At this stage, the activity started to focus on my brother. He lived on the same property as the rest of us, but not in the main house. He was lucky enough to have his own one-bedroom cabin that sat only about 10 meters from the main house. One night, he was studying for an exam when something attacked him from behind. My brother was a large guy and was a regular at the gym, but he was no match for whatever it was that attacked him. This thing that he could not see bombarded my brother with blow after blow to his head and body, but it seemed as though these blows were only secondary to its main objective. Every chance it got, this entity would latch onto my brother's throat and squeeze. My brother struggled with his thing for at least 15 minutes, and when the entity finally relented, my brother was covered in blood. He had cuts and bruises all over his body, resembling slash marks, almost like the entity had claws. And of course, my brother was not the only victim. My mom received special treatment as well, suffering from bouts of paralysis at any given moment. My mother said it felt like an eternity was passing by while she lay there with a feeling like some entity was hovering only inches away over top of her. She could feel her energy being slowly drawn out of her body. She would get weaker by the second and more tired until finally she would pass out, only to awaken perfectly fine a few hours later. She would say that as she was fading into unconsciousness, she could see a transparent image of someone inches away from her face, and its face was tinted reddish pink, almost as if it were bloody. My aunt was a very religious woman and did not believe anything she was being told. My mother tried to confide in her, but she wouldn't accept the possibility of anything paranormal, and she scoffed at the mention of witches. So her sister paid a visit along with her niece, who was about 8 at the time. They were having a relaxing soak in the bath when suddenly the window shattered and a stone came hurtling into the bathroom, hitting the vanity mirror, breaking it. Despite the unnerving incident, my aunt made the courageous decision to stay the night. However, come morning, to our surprise, both my aunt and niece had vanished without a trace. They had silently packed their belongings in the dead of night and headed out on their long journey back home. On a side note, my parents were pretty impressed by her brashness, especially considering she had to venture outside and traverse the 20 meters to her car while the desert witch was around. The next time she spoke with my mother, she hinted at something disturbing happened in the spare bedroom shortly after she went to bed, but she remained tight-lipped about the details. Shortly after my aunt left, things took on a more dangerous approach to its methods. Fires. Spontaneous fires started around the employees' cabins. At first, we thought it was careless workers, but we quickly learned that this wasn't the case. It started out almost harmless, just small little fires starting in the fireplace, nothing too crazy. But one day, one of the employees came screaming that one of their workers' houses was burning down and that the flames were leaping from the windows. The worker was on leave and the door was locked. When they finally opened the door, witnesses saw that the entire room was engulfed in flames, but after the flames were extinguished and all the smoke subsided, they were shocked to find that there was no damage at all. My parents were now desperate. My father had put all their savings into this farm and selling was not an option, and so believing extraordinary circumstances called for extraordinary measures, he contacted a traditional medicine man from the Navajo people. When the medicine man came, he asked for a glass of water, looked into it, and told my father things of a very personal nature. Things very few people knew, and most certainly no one in the town knew. The medicine man started to perform a cleansing ritual before he walked over to the corner of the living room and looked at the floor. He bent down and lifted one of the floorboards. He then reached into the hole and pulled out a small plain box covered in dust. The medicine man brought it back to the circle he had created and sat down with my parents, opening the box in front of them. Inside, they seen that it had been filled with stuff like fingernail clippings and hair. He then went on to tell my dad that someone had put a curse on the farm. He didn't know why, and he didn't try to speculate a reason either. The night after the cleansing, a storm came up, but instead of thunder, there was the sound of a crying baby. This was 100 times more terrifying than the stones falling on the roof had been. We listened, huddled together as the wind blew from one border fence of the farm to the other, about 2,000 hectares, and then, just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. From that moment on, life was normal. Nothing else happened, and we moved forward the only way we knew how. By living life the way we had intended to in the first place. Most people don't believe my story, but that's okay. I know it's pretty difficult to accept, but I know it's real, and that's all that matters in the end.
Come step into a world where magic is not just a fantasy, but a reality at the Freethinker Project Witchcraft Supply Store online. Our ever-expanding collection of witchcraft supplies, from magical herbs to powerful altar tools, invites you to unlock your inner potential and explore the mysteries of the universe, selected for their authenticity and power. Each item is a gateway to personal transformation and magical discovery. Join our community of seekers and believers. Read through our Book of Shadows and enjoy the ever-growing content at freethinkerproj.com. We ship worldwide, so you can begin your journey into the mystical today. Let the ritual begin.